Okay. All right. Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. And thanks for joining us for another edition of New England Chapter Connects. Certainly a very important topic that we have for you today, ethics in action, a guide for public works leaders, and also, managing gray areas and supporting public trust in public service. So it's great to see them. We have folks, we can see folks are still continuing to join. So we have a lot of folks on the call this morning from all over New England and beyond. So welcome, everyone. My name is Rich Benevento. I am the APWA Region 1 Director and Senior Vice President at Ty and Bond. Today's session is designed specifically for municipal employees, particularly those in public works management. You will hear from public works ethics experts discussing the importance of ethical behavior in maintaining public trust, and explore common ethical challenges faced in municipal public works departments. In addition to discussing potentially ethical gray areas, they'll also be discussing a practical framework for ethical decision-making, best practices for reporting and addressing ethical concerns, and review the critical role of leadership in fostering a transparent and accountable workplace culture. This should be a great session. We're glad you're able to join us. Just a couple of things before we get started. First, many thanks to our Public Works Awareness Committee and Education Committee. These groups are working hard to bring important topics to our members and bring speakers to our panel that you may not necessarily have regular access to. So it's a great group doing great work to support public works. Also, a big shout out to our program producer, Regina Hackett. She does an amazing job organizing the communication, logistics, and technology for our New England Chapter Connects program. So we want to thank Regina. We certainly could not do this without her. Regina, raise your hand, wave to everybody. There you go. There's Regina right there. And of course, let's not forget our New England Chapter sponsors. Without the support of our sponsors, we could not bring all of the valuable programs and events to our members in the public works community. Our sponsors continue to step up to support the New England Chapter in our public works community. So we want to really give them a great amount of gratitude for their support of the chapter. The New England Chapter Connects program was originally created to keep us all connected. Today's session will wrap up our 2024 New England Chapter Connect season, but we already have some great topics lined up for 2025 with our first session scheduled for March 27th. You can see that right on the screen there. So be sure to mark your calendars so you are able to attend. And remember, all of the New England Chapter Connect sessions are recorded. So if you or your staff or your crew miss any of the topics, you can watch them anytime by logging on to the chapter website at newengland.apwa.org. This is great if you're having lunch and learns and things like that. We've gotten a lot of feedback from public works departments who utilize the New England Chapter Connects videos. So good stuff there. Lastly, if you're not an APWA member and would like to become a member or would like more information on upcoming New England Chapter Connect sessions or are interested in becoming a sponsor, all of this information can be found on our New England Chapter website, as I mentioned, newengland.apwa.org. So you want to check that out. Okay, so let's get going. We're going to start with our session this morning. We probably could spend an entire day on this topic, but we only have an hour, so we're going to get right at it. It's with great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel of speakers. David Giannotti is the Chief of the Public Education and Communication Division of the Massachusetts State Ethics Commission. David's been with the commission for 36 years, starting as an investigator in the commission's enforcement division. David is responsible for the educational seminar program, media relations, communication, publications, the statewide mandatory conflict of interest law education program, and the agency's website. David obtained his BS in Policy Administration from Northern Arizona University and is a graduate of the Arizona Law Enforcement Training Academy. So welcome, David. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you to the APWA.
You're welcome. It's great to have you here. Our next speaker is, our next panelist is Matthew Reed. Matt is the first town administrator for the town of Ellington, Connecticut, where he serves as the town's chief administrative officer since August 2023. Matt was a Connecticut police officer for nearly 28 years and retired as chief of police in 2015. Matt is also an attorney in his work for the state of Connecticut as a staff attorney for the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission and the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection. Throughout his work in private practice, as well as municipal and state service, Matt has provided training, advice, and policy guidance in the area of government ethics. So welcome, Matt, and welcome, David. Thanks for both of you for being
so
here.
much. Great to be here.
So we have a series of questions that we're going to pepper David and Matt with. But before we get to that, I'd like to at least start this off and get some information from either of you. I'd like each of you to give us your perspective on ethics in action, and just what your perspective is of that. And I'd like to start with David.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you all for attending today. I can speak about Massachusetts conflict of interest law and those requirements that apply to state, county, and municipal employees in Massachusetts. And I always have to throw out the caveat that I am not a lawyer, so I don't give out legal advice. So some of you may work for public works departments in Massachusetts, so what I have to say is relevant to you, but the principles I'm going to talk about can apply generally. When you're talking about ethical concerns and being in public service, we're not reporting to a board of directors. We're not profit centers. We work for the taxpayers. And an overarching principle of ethics is acting in the public interest when you're talking about government. Public employees should always conduct themselves so that there isn't an appearance of favoritism, that their actions are always in the public interest and not based on any self-serving motive or meant to favor anyone else. And so in Massachusetts, we have seven different topics that constitute our conflict of interest law, but that's the main theme for all of it, to ensure that there is confidence in government because public employees are acting in the public interest, and where there are situations that come up, the law will impose restrictions. So our law is always designed to hit an ever-moving target. In what circumstance or situation could a public employee be improperly influenced? Whether it's gift giving, whether it's in hiring decisions, could the public employee be improperly influenced in how they make decisions so that the public, looking at how the public's business is being conducted, would become concerned about whether the employee is acting in the public interest or not? And we always talk about optics because there are circumstances that maybe don't implicate an ethical standard, but the optics are such that, you really need to decide whether this is worth it or not. You really need to decide whether people looking at the circumstance and the public actions being taken, whether it'll blow up or not, whether people will get the wrong idea. If you are in the private sector and you do business with government, this is very important because you want to continue to do business with government. And there's nothing that will chill the relationship with public agencies and public employees if ethical standards falter, if lines get crossed.
Excellent. Thank you, David. One of the other things too, we talk about public employees, but I think we talked yesterday when we were speaking. For example, I'm on a board and a commission in my community, so those are sometimes also looked at as special employees. But let's go to Matt. Matt, let's talk about ethics in action. How do you view that?
I love dealing with ethics questions because oftentimes if somebody calls you with an ethics question, chances are they know that what they're asking you about is probably something that they shouldn't get involved in, right? And sometimes they want you to say, yeah, you're right, that's not a good idea. You should find an alternative way to do it. But I think David brings up a good point, right? You have to act in the best interest of the public. And I always say, and I know many others say it, if the actions you take would look okay on the front page of your local paper of record, then you're probably okay. But if you think about how somebody would articulate the actions that you took, and how a person with no real connection to your particular department that you work in or your municipality or state agency were to read that article, would they say, ooh, this was pretty slippery. Why did they possibly make that decision? That's always a good lens to look through when you're trying to make a decision, whether when you're trying to decide how to act in a particular situation. But before we get into specific questions, of course, the definition of ethics, what does that mean? It means different things to different people. We're talking about moral principles that may govern a person's behavior, standards of right and wrong, what a person ought to do in terms of obligations or benefits to society, fairness, or your specific virtues, moral principles. So these are things that are not always concrete. There are some ethical standards that are in fact concrete, right? If you're in a decision-making capacity within a municipality or within your public works department, and your brother happens to run the local paving outfit, it's probably not a good idea for your brother to get all of the paving contracts, right? Some things are clear, but then other things start to get a little less clear. Maybe he's the lowest bidder. He hasn't bid before, and now he's the one who is probably the most qualified to get the contract because he has a connection with you and other people in state government. Maybe the decisions that person is going to make are going to be beneficial to everybody. But you have to figure out, how do you make that decision without it looking like you're favoring your brother who owns this company? Maybe you have to remove yourself completely. Maybe you just need to disclose the relationship and make sure that you're very, we love this word, transparent in the decision-making process. So these are principles, the way of doing things that are open, so people are aware of them, and the importance of disclosing the actions that you take and helping people understand the decision-making process. I think all of these are examples of ethics in action. And of course, ethics and ethical behavior doesn't stand alone in a silo. You've got to lead by example. You have to have policies. You have to have reference to some sort of, maybe a commission or some sort of governing body that oversees ethics for your municipality. But, the idea of doing the right thing when no one is looking is really kind of sums up what ethics are all about. But we're going to talk more about that in detail as we move forward. We talk about ethics in action. I think it's just important to know that all ethical questions don't have necessarily a black and white answer. Sometimes you make decisions that from an optics standpoint may not look like they were appropriate. Maybe they have the appearance of impropriety, but the reality is, when you drill into the facts, it was a correct decision, or it was an acceptable decision. But again, a lot of that has to do with openness and communication. You can find you can get out of so many binds if you simply communicate and disclose what your decision-making process was. But with that, that's kind of my brief overview of my position when it comes to making ethical decisions. And so I'll turn it back over to you, and let's move forward and look at some of the challenges that we face and some of the questions we have here.
Excellent segue to Matt, because my first question has to do with transparency and accountability. And I know you mentioned that word, transparency. So what role does transparency and accountability play in maintaining ethical standards in municipal governance? And how can local governments enhance these aspects? So you were on a roll. We'll go back to you, Matt, and then I want to hear from David.
Well, so I've been involved in municipal and state government for over 30 years now. I know I look incredibly young, but I'm sorry about that. No, but nonetheless, between my military service time, my time in the police department, and then my time working for state agencies, the time racks up, and so you always work in a fishbowl. That's my point, right? And people are always looking at the decisions that you make. And I spent a great deal of my time with a particular bent towards freedom of information. And in fact, I went to law school with the goal of hopefully one day being an FOI attorney. And ultimately, that's what I did after I retired from the police department. As I moved into Connecticut's Freedom of Information Commission, I was a hearing officer and a staff attorney there. I say that because when it comes to transparency and accountability, that's been a big part of my career and a big part of what my focus has been in my legal practice as well. And these go hand in hand. Ethics and transparency, accountability, they work together. If people can see what you're doing, I came from a police department that was very open in its disclosure of what happened in the department day to day, what happened with personnel decisions, what happened with criminal activity. And not all agencies are that way. There are some who feel like we've been hired to do a job, and you don't need to know, how we make the sausage, right? We don't need to tell you. So first thing is that you have to have that mindset that you're working for the people, and that what you do, even though you're a public works, maybe you work, maybe you work in the shop, or maybe you work as a plow driver or an equipment operator, or a public works leader. What you do, look, it's a huge part of the budget, right? You're spending a lot of the people's money. So you've got to be able to be willing to disclose where the money is going, what you're spending the money on, and what's your decision-making process. We had an issue this year, had to do with trees, removing a number of trees in order to build a parking lot. And for the first time ever, I think Connecticut law allows you to appeal the removal of a public tree. And we had to have a public hearing about why we were taking down these 6 or 7 trees. And it was something we hadn't been through before, and people couldn't believe that we had to engage in this process. And the direction I gave was, look, here's how we do public hearings. Here's how we're going to hold this hearing. We're going to make sure people know that it's happening. So you give notice, and you have an agenda, and you have it put on Zoom or televise it somehow, so people could see the process. And a lot of people thought, well, even from the outside, thought this is ridiculous. We're doing all of this. We have to take these trees down. But the reality is, it made it less painful because the town was very open in how they were going to do this. They wrote a couple of news stories about it, and that we had this hearing, and we were going to let this person make their argument, and publicly argue to save the trees. Mr. Lorax, I think was the name, and because they didn't think it was right that we were just, as the government, going to go through and take these trees down. And they were on our property, no less. I say our property, I guess it's the people's property. But the point here is that it was transparent. We didn't just schedule a hearing for some obscure time or later in the evening, and we didn't do it privately, without it being televised and being properly noticed. It was a public meeting and a public hearing, and we made everybody aware that it was happening. And so people ultimately understood the decision that was made and how that decision was made. So I think that, that's kind of a micro example, but you take that into the decisions that you make every day. And transparency and accountability, of course, adds a tremendous amount of confidence on the part of the public in what you're doing, if they're able to see exactly how the sausage is made, how the decisions are made. So I think it very much falls in hand, along with some other elements we're going to talk about, with having a good ethics policy and practice.
So David, over to you. I mean,
I don't know that there's anything left for me to say, but I'll try. I loved one of the things that Matt touched on, and that is the ability to make the right decision when nobody's looking. That's the heart of that ethical standards from its highest level. But I think what we all understand is that people are interested in what happens. Doesn't matter whether it affects them or not. So when government operates at the behest of the people, the public is interested in what's going on. So you can't do enough to be transparent, and you can't assume that this is so mundane that nobody's going to care, because we all know people are political. It always marvels me at the local level that somebody will have to spend their treasure on a piece of property, and then they want to develop that property, and then everybody around them wants to tell them how they can develop their property. And the reason is that people have an interest in what goes on in government. Transparency is very important. If you look at it from a pyramid, at the tip of the pyramid is confidence in government. The public has a right to expect that the public employees will always act in their interest. And so what steps are taken to make sure we have confidence in government, that we foster confidence in government? Transparency is part of that process. We are conducting the public's business. There is a record of how the public's business is being conducted. And in connection with ethical standards, whenever there is a potential that an ethical standard will falter, or that a public employee participating in the public's business may have a bias, it may sway their decision-making because of that bias. Transparency goes a long way to curing that. In Massachusetts, the conflict of interest law has requirements for transparency. A public employee can't perform a duty if what they will do will affect some tangible component of their private life, the people and the entities that they affiliate with off the job, unless they first disclose that conflict of interest, that particular bias. And it can't be done after the fact. It must be done beforehand so that the public can have confidence that if an employee has a potential bias, the cards have been put on the table. And that's the essence of transparency. You got to put the cards on the table so that people looking at how the business was conducted are not going to say there was favoritism or somebody failed to act in the public interest. And the accountability occurs, again, Matt was referencing top down. The culture has to be set at the top, and it has to constantly be reinforced, or people will forget, or they'll assume things that, oh, this isn't important. From the top down, there's got to be standards set, and they must be constantly reinforced. The accountability comes in when people should be transparent and then they're not. The accountability comes in with how they're being transparent. So, okay, I'm going to consider this application and it affects a friend of mine. I'm just going to tell the boss orally and then I'm just going to continue. No, there's the standard for a written disclosure. And how is it filed? Well, you got to be transparent of any potential biases, and you put your agency on notice through the person we refer to as the appointing authority. By putting the agency on notice that one of its employees has a potential bias, it allows the agency to react. Under Massachusetts law, the conflict law has standards for public employees that have biases, but it also enables an agency to take whatever steps they feel are appropriate. And that's to deal with the optics, because we've had plenty of situations where the law hasn't been violated, but situations have blown up. And there's nothing worse that can affect the efficiency of government is when you have a story that won't go away that's on page 1 because somebody thought the fix was in, even when it wasn't.
Oh, good stuff, David. By the way, folks that are on the call, if you have questions, because we are going to take questions, you can put them in the chat, and Regina is going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, certainly use the chat box, and we can get those questions answered. So we talked a lot about the public viewpoints and optics and things like that. How can municipalities foster a culture of ethical behavior among staff and elected officials while also engaging the community in the ethical decision-making process? And David, let's go back to you.
Well, I think transparency goes a long way. But the standards, government agencies should have standards of conduct for their employees. And one of those standards should be, if you're doing anything and it affects somebody you, your friends, your family, any businesses that you affiliate with off the job, whenever those circumstances come up, you have to tell someone. The biggest mistakes that public employees make in Massachusetts that, unfortunately result in our commission taking enforcement action is when they calculate incorrectly. They assume something is not going to be a big deal or that nobody's going to find out about it. We work in government. We don't get to hide like the criminals on the street do. We can't conceal our involvement. We can't conceal our identities. We work in the public sector. And so it is vitally important that when an ethical concern can arise, that we don't guess. We don't assume nobody's going to find out about it. We hammer constantly, you have to get out in front on situations and don't assume something is not a big deal and don't assume that nobody's going to find out about it. When something happens, always, always, always tell the boss. Let the boss know so that the boss can decide what to do about it. Now, we have statutory requirements in certain situations, but absent any statutory requirements, the best course of action for public agencies is to make sure that everybody's on the same page and that employees are telling their superiors. Doesn't matter what level you are in the organization. You could be a manager, a supervisor, a foreman, a line employee. When a situation comes up, tell the boss.
Matt, how about you? Same question.
I think to back out even farther from what David from the specific items David is speaking of, is look at, first of all, in each of the states, whether you're in Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Massachusetts, each of those states has some sort of state level ethics commission or ethics body, right? Which is really step number one. Is to take a look at what the state rule is and what the state statute is. For example, in Connecticut, we have the Connecticut Ethics Commission and the Citizens Ethics Advisory Council, which are both statutory statewide bodies, and they have the authority to investigate and to hold hearings on state level employee ethics issues, whether they're state officials or state employees. And part of that statute, so they adopt a statewide code of ethics, and part of that statute empowers municipalities throughout the state to adopt their own municipal code of ethics. So that's kind of step one, is your municipality should, and this goes to transparency and accountability, should have a town-wide or citywide code of ethics that they adopt. That's really the first step, so that you know what the expectations are. And of course, the adoption of such a policy or an ordinance is generally a public process before they make those decisions, because it's kind of it's a legislative action in many communities. So that immediately gets people involved. So now people in the community, from your governing body, whatever that might be, whether it's a city council, town council, board of selectmen, whatever they happen to call it in your community, they have to hold public hearings and they have to have votes. And so that immediately gets the community involved. Some communities have their own outside of the ethics policy. That policy creates an ethics commission. And so you might have a local ethics commission. Again, these local commissions are staffed with who? Local volunteers. So again, this brings the community into knowing that this is a concern. Now, I think we all get frustrated because we have a lot of these public bodies, and really there's kind of a small core of municipal residents that get involved in these different boards and commissions. And so while you and I and the people that are volunteering for those boards and commissions deal with these things frequently and they're aware of them, 90% of the population has no idea they exist. And no matter whether you use your social media through Facebook or Twitter or whatever you might use, or your web page to advertise this information, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't force them to drink, right? People aren't necessarily going to go and browse your ethics website day to day, because it's just simply not that exciting until they see it in the newspaper because somebody's been accused of something. People will say, I never knew that we did that. I didn't know we had an ethics commission. But again, talking about transparency, using your social media and your website. And I know some communities engage very actively in social media platforms and others don't. But if you do engage in the use of social media platforms and suddenly somebody comes up because there's been some issue, they go, well, we should have an ethics council. And you go, well, we do have one. And here's their website, and here's their Twitter page, or here's their feed on the website. If you can point to those things and show people that you are actively trying to engage the public, that always helps boost some of your credibility, because you say, no, we've been putting the information out there. You just haven't happened to find it. So that's another way you can be transparent. But my point here is that you should have, it's a good idea to have some sort of ethics policy in your community, and make sure that you train your employees on it. And you have to make it a big deal. It can't be a one-time training. You should train them annually and make them sign off on an ethics agreement or an ethics policy that says you have reviewed it, you understand it, and if you see something, some conduct that you believe is unethical, you'll report it. And it's kind of rote, to have people do that every year. People go, oh, I did it last year, but it puts it in their head, right? Because I always think ahead to the day you're in the courtroom, because now there's been some lawsuit or something. And the question is asked, does your town have a policy? And you say, well, yes, it does. Well, how are you familiar with that policy? And they go, because every year we have to sit down and review it and we have to sign. Well, from the municipality's standpoint, that's a great answer, because it shows that you didn't just have initial training when you got there, but every year for your 5, 10, 15 years you've been there, you've had to sign this policy. Some even go so far as to have financial disclosures. I know when I worked as an attorney in the commissioner's office for the state police, I had to do a financial disclosure every year because I was making decisions on contracting and procurement. And so the ethics rules in our states required a financial disclosure. What stocks do I hold? How much do I have in savings? Where's my money come from? Who do the people in my household work for? And what are their, and I have 5 kids. And so it was always a thrill to fill that out every year because you have to disclose all of it. Again, it's part of that transparency module where you are letting people know exactly what you are engaged in and what companies you're involved in. So again, not to get too far out on that, but having a policy, having a review practice, having a training practice, having people sign off on the policy is all part of leading by example and making sure your employees understand that they're in a fishbowl and their decision making and their actions day to day are subject to examination by the public. But a good source of information, if your community is a little weak in this area, is to check out the state website and understand what your state rules are. You might find that you're required to do certain things and maybe you're not doing them. And as a public works director, you've got to reach out to your town administrator, town manager, mayor, first selectman, whoever happens to be the leader of your community and say, listen, we're kind of lacking on this. We should have an ethics policy. We should have an ethics board. So be aware of what they have. And one other thing that they often have on the website is they have advisory opinions, because oftentimes these state level boards and commissions, one of their charges are to listen to people's questions and issue these advisory opinions. And they can be very helpful in understanding what ethical issues arise from time to time in different municipalities, and what the opinion is of the Ethics Commission as to whether this person should have certain post-employment opportunities, or they should work a second job while they're working for the municipality, or whatever it might be. There's a whole host. I think you'd be surprised at the number of ethical conflicts that come up that they have to issue advisory opinions on. So that's a great source of information. I'll end it there because I know we'll talk about some of these other things as we move forward.
And it's interesting, as a volunteer, I've been volunteering in my community for close to 40 years, and I get that form every year, even as a special employee in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, special employee. I don't get paid, I'm a volunteer, but you still have to fill out those forms. And yeah, it's a little bit of a wake-up call, right, when you're reading that and going through it. So good stuff.
And just one further point, I mean, this adds to the challenge, because who are the people that are most likely to get involved in either elected office or these volunteer boards and commissions? Oftentimes, they are the movers and shakers in the community. So it might be the owner of the local contracting company, the owner of the local hardware store, the owner of, right, or someone who's the supervisor for the water company, all entities that the municipality may have to do business with. So you can see how those ethical challenges start to come up, because suddenly the guy that owns a hardware store is on the board of selectmen, and you're trying to decide whether you should buy things from that hardware store because they are the lowest price. I mean, you can see where you start to get these ethical challenges, and you say, well, we don't want to disadvantage this person because they are an elected official or because they volunteered to be on this board of commission. But at the same time, the optics are not good that you're buying from somebody who has some engagement as a town official.
Well, and that's a good segue again to the next question, and that is about enforcement and consequences. So what mechanisms should be in place to enforce ethical standards at the municipal level, and what consequences should exist for breaches of ethics by public officials? And I know, David, I want to go to you on that one.
Sure. Well, that's right. A policy is only as good as its enforcement mechanism. We get calls. People think that we're the wealth of information for all things government. And no, our jurisdiction is the conflict of interest law in Massachusetts. But things happen where people go, why is this allowed to occur? Why, if we have a selectman a board that's acting dysfunctionally, why can't we recall them? Well, because you need a policy in place, but the policy is only as good as the enforcement mechanism that comes with it. You could have a policy without enforcement, and it's not as good as, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. So it's really thinking things through and coming up with mechanisms. Okay, what are the issues we're going to be faced with? What are we going to do about it? In Massachusetts, we do have effective enforcement. That's the least part of what we do. the most part of enforcement and consequences is to make sure that there is information available to public employees so that they can understand their legal obligations. The most important service we provide is free, confidential legal advice. We tell people you are required to comply with this law. If you're uncertain about how to do so, we can give you confidential advice about how to do so, but you have to call us up front. If you do not, and you engage in conduct because you don't think it's a big deal, or you don't think anyone's going to find out about it, and because you're a public employee acting, conducting the public's business, so somebody's going to find out about it, then we have the ability to deal with it. Our commission has full authority to determine what is and what is not a conflict of interest, and can impose civil penalties of up to $10,000 for significant violations of the law, with the exception of our bribery statute or section in the conflict law. For that, it's $25,000. So we've got teeth in the law, but our commission will only take action if there's an egregious violation. In other words, it's not just a violation of the conflict law. There's some bad conduct where the conflict law underpins that, some self-dealing. We call it black letter law. If you hire a family member to a job in your agency, you should know better. We don't have much sympathy for that. Anybody who does that, they're going to pay a fine. And our fines are probably averaging for, I'm a fire chief and I hired my son as a firefighter. I'm going to pay a fine of probably $7,500 to $10,000. We had a case where a fire chief did the right thing at first because the son was a firefighter. They backed out of it. But then the son didn't make the first cut, and that didn't sit well. So he then intervened, manipulated the process, had his subordinates redo the process for the screening committee, and added conditions, qualifications, if you will, where the son then was favored because of their unique qualification, things like that. So our law can deal with significant violations, but that's the least part of what we do. The most part is to be available to public employees. We tell them all the time, this law is complicated, but you don't have to be an expert in it. That's our job. You just need to know to use the resources that are available to you, and that's calling us. So there are serious consequences for significant violations, but our main mission is education, and where somebody may have violated the law, but there's a way where they're not in compliance and we can get them into compliance, that's our chosen method. And we are required by law to operate in secret. So nothing gets on the front page unless the commission has decided, yeah, you violated the law and you're going to pay this civil penalty. Everything up to that point stays under the radar permanently. And, somebody takes on a second public job that the law prohibited, we're going to say, hey, you're violating the conflict law. You got to give up one of those jobs, or you got to get permission from this board for you to take on things like that. So compliance, getting people into compliance, being reasonable about it, because we don't want to chill people from serving in government. We need them. So if you have onerous laws and everybody's going to face penalty at the drop of a hat, nobody's going to want to volunteer to serve in government. So we've got to be very reasonable in our approach, but there are consequences for the significant violations where people engaged in conduct and they knew better or they should have known better.
So David, before I go to Matt, I want to go back to your example about the firefighter whose son was going for the job, right? So let's say, for example, that son had all of the qualifications. The town was looking for firefighters. How could he have had the opportunity to be an employee, or he just never would be able to be working for that town because his dad was the fire chief? Or how would that work? What is that gray area?
All things are allowed. You just have to understand where the ethical standard is and take steps to deal with it. So in our situation, that circumstance falls under the nepotism section of the conflict law. And the nepotism section of the conflict law doesn't say, you outsider who are applying for a government job, you're precluded because your family member works. No, anybody can go to work for government. It's incumbent upon the public employee who would normally have a role in the matter to deal with it. they have to step back. If it's an immediate family member, such as a son or a daughter or a sibling or a parent, the law says you got to stay out of hiring decisions if it affects immediate family. If it affects non-immediate family, such as a cousin or a friend, the law doesn't say you have to stay out of it. The law says before you participate where you have a friend or a non-immediate family member who's an applicant, you got to tell the boss in writing. That's that transparency piece, so that the boss knows you have a potential bias here, so that the boss can monitor and take steps. In most cases, the boss would step in and say, let's get you out of it. But it's the public, it could be incumbent on the public employee to step back from a matter that they would ordinarily be required to handle. Now, how can they do that effectively? By first going to their boss and setting up a process that allows them to step away from it, because their boss will assign somebody else to act in their stead.
Awesome. So Matt, local level, Ellington, Connecticut, right? How are you dealing with these kinds of things and consequences for breaches of these ethical behavior matters?
Yeah, when it comes to consequences, your policy has to address that. That has to be part of the policy. No statutes. I think David said the same thing, right? No statute's any good unless there's an enforcement provision. What are you going to do if somebody breaks the law? If you don't have consequences, then they're just nice words, so there have to be some consequences. So if you're involved in the drafting of an ethics policy, you have to make sure there's some sort of recognition of what the consequences could be. And the consequences, first of all, refer to state law and make sure there's not a state law that already says what the consequences are if you violate certain provisions of the state ethics code, or you could even have a state law that reaches to any municipal ethics code. So make sure there's not a provision in the state law that already sets forth what the consequences are. But in your local policy, the considerations are there going to be legal consequences for what somebody did, or is this going to be something you're going to turn over for prosecution either through the police department or your local district attorney or state's attorney's office based on the severity of the violation? Are there going to be financial consequences? Here in Ellington, the policy allows for, first of all, there's a hearing process through the ethics, the local ethics board. And if you're found to have violated, you could be fined up to $250 for each violation. Of course, and if it turns out to be a legal violation, you could be referred to the police for a police investigation and then further action in accordance with whatever the local criminal justice system says. But then there are other the other consequences could certainly be reputational damage. Maybe you're no longer eligible for a promotion. Maybe you are suspended or you're terminated, depending on your status as an exempt or not exempt employee and union representation and all those types of things. But of course, that type of discipline is always possible and has to be acknowledged in the code of ethics that that's one of the options that can be explored. Employee discontent. Right? You lead by example. So if you have somebody who is accused of ethical wrongdoing and it looks like they, first of all, that hearing process in Connecticut, that would be completely open. That process would be an open process. Those hearings would be open hearings. And so the charges and the results of the hearing process or the investigation would be public, including the exoneration or, for lack of a better term, a conviction or a finding that they're responsible for those actions. That would all be public. So if you don't take action, employee discontent, what does it say to everybody else in your agency or in your municipality if you don't take some sort of action? We deal with this as supervisors every day when you have to discipline an employee. If somebody knows that an employee is engaged in bad conduct and you don't ever do anything about it, well, then what do those rules really mean if you're not going to enforce them? The social backlash. Other people in the community, you work in a small community like ours, people beyond the public works department or beyond the town hall most likely know that this controversy exists. And if they know that nothing has happened to quell the controversy or hold the person accountable, well, now you get the social backlash that, well, the town's not really a reputable organization. They don't do anything to the people who break the rules. And then, of course, finally, there's the professional consequences. If you want to move up in the ranks and maybe you want to move from assistant director to director, or you want to move from foreman to assistant director, or whatever it might be, if you want to move up in the profession, and then there are these questionable decisions or questionable actions on your part, then that can certainly harm your ability to move through an organization. But the important thing is that check the state law and make sure there's nothing there that dictates what the consequences are, even for a local city or municipal violation. And then your code of ethics has to acknowledge what happens, what is the investigatory process, and what are the possible consequences based on the behavior that you've been found responsible for. So it's all, again, all part of the overall process, and consequences are important. But it's hard to have absolutes because you have to examine each situation based on the circumstances.
So, you know, we've talked about, and I think early on, both of you gave a good example of really what ethics is all about. You know, is it going to look good on above the fold in the newspaper kind of a thing? But there are some gray areas, and I think, David, you had mentioned, you know, there are resources available for people to reach out. Hey, and how do I deal with this? But at the local level, defining ethics may be different from one community to another. Core principles. What are the core principles that should guide a local government official in their decision making? And I know you said it's one thing to say you don't want to have your name on the front page of the newspaper, but can you dig a little deeper into that, and just in terms of what local governments should be doing in terms of their decision making? And David, let's go to you.
Well, you know, the issue occurs in Massachusetts whenever a public employee is participating as such, and they have a private interest in the matter. That sort of triggers the conflict law, and there are specific restrictions, but that overarching principle, participating in matters where you have a potential bias, that is the essence of the law. So at the municipal level, you need to think about, you know, because, and especially in our smaller communities, everybody knows everybody. You know, what triggers an ethical standard, you know, where you know so many people? Well, that can be fleshed out a little bit, but you need to think about those situations where somebody can get the wrong idea or somebody can become concerned, because we work in government. You know, we regulate, we inspect, we approve, we, in some measure, we build. In everything we do, some people benefit, some people may not. Who are the people that are going to become concerned about the decision-making by public employees? Those people who may not qualify for something that they want. You know, whenever we say, okay, you're part of a committee to award a bid, and there are 5 bidders, and the bidders learn that one of those bidders took you to lunch and paid for your lunch. What are those other 4 bidders going to conclude about the process? And that's something where you should have, you know, you should have thought about that before you accepted the lunch. And so again, the standards for municipals are, whenever a situation arises and you have a potential bias, that should trigger some action. That should trigger some inquiry at a minimum. Because even where a vendor has taken you to lunch, that creates a bias. The other vendors competing for the products or services to sell you are going to be concerned about whether somebody wined and dined you, and they then have an unfair competitive advantage on getting contracts.
Stuff. How about you, Matt?
You know, I think a lot of what we're talking about, right? You get a sense of those principles, and some of those are intangible, but the way you act according to your moral compass and what you should do right. But maybe it helps to define that answer a bit more when we talk about what types of actions are covered in ethics statutes. And again, they're different in different states, but and oftentimes, and when I talk about Connecticut's ethics statute, you'll understand this a little better. Sometimes statutes are written in response to an activity that has occurred. So there was a number of years ago where one of Connecticut's governors had to step down because there was a contractor had provided some services at the governor's personal home that seemed relatively minor at the time, but nonetheless, there never should have been a question as to whether, you know, the contractor should have been compensated or not for the services that they provided, but apparently there was a question as to whether that compensation ever occurred. And as a result, it blew up and was boiling for so long, the governor ultimately had to step down. And so when you look at Connecticut's ethics statutes, you'll see that it focuses a lot on gifts from vendors, lobbyists, people who do business with the state, to state officials or state employees. So it goes on and on about the value of gifts that you can receive and that you can't receive, and who is the giver of the gift. Are they considered a restricted donor or a non-restricted donor? Is it somebody who's running for office? Is it somebody who's looking to be qualified as a vendor with the state? There's all sorts of language dealing with gifts. Donations to political campaigns. Are they restricted donors, non-restricted donors? Again, more about how much business did they do with the state, because you can tell, as David said, what's going to be the appearance or what's going to be the expectation or the public perception of that gift or that donation to that public official or public employee. People always love to think the worst and think that, well, the reason you're getting this money is because you're expecting to be viewed as a preferred vendor on the state's list or whatever it might be. So gifts, even gifts between employees. I mean, in Connecticut, the code of ethics for the state employees is you can't exchange gifts with a colleague that's valued at more than $50. $50, I think, and you can't provide a gift to your boss that's more than $100. And then there's all this talk about a significant life event. You can pool your money, but you can't give them a gift that's valued at more than $1,000. I mean, they get into this nitty gritty about, we used to go out to lunch every month, and it'd be, oh, I'll pay for everybody's lunch. And it's like, oh, you can't do that because it's going to cost you $150, and that would be a gift to all these. I mean, it was just almost too much. But you can understand that not only do these ethics laws always deal with activity between the public and the government official or the government employee, but they also, depending on your state, may deal with the interactions between you and your subordinates, you and your superior, or you and your colleagues, your equals in the office, and how much you can give to each other. The idea being that you don't want to be seen as influencing a supervisor's decision because maybe they now have to enforce a penalty against you. So you really have to understand what your local rules are as far as what their concerns are from an ethical standpoint. Conflicts of interest are a big deal. Are you going to take official action that would affect your personal financial interests? And this is where we get into some of these gray areas where you have a selectman or a mayor or a council member who is connected to the local hardware store, the local contractor, or some other provider of service in town. And again, now we move back towards that transparency and the disclosures. And if the interaction between those entities isn't outright prohibited, at least understanding the optics of what it would look like if somebody who's related to a contractor is awarding contracts and so forth, that those disclosures are there. So gifts, donations, conflicts of interest, and then even potential conflicts of interest. And these are things that aren't really direct conflicts of interest, but appear to be inappropriate or appear as though they could create some sort of conflict of interest in the future. And some of the codes of ethics and statutes go on to talk about post-employment. I worked for an attorney for the Freedom of Information Commission, and so I'm prohibited for a year, or I was prohibited for a year post-employment from representing anybody before the Freedom of Information Commission. Again, that's one of the state's ethic laws. And if I did that, the state could reach out to me and I could be penalized for violating the state ethics code. So disclosure of confidential information, often this type of activity is governed in the ethics statute or the ethics code. You can't disclose information that you gleaned in the course of your position once you leave your position, and certainly not to benefit you or a member of your family. So again, it's coming back to understanding what is in your code of ethics that governs you locally, and understanding that you're going to be held responsible for doing the right thing. And if you find yourself scratching your head going, should I do this or should I not do this? That's when I encourage you to reach out to your local council, your town attorney, your city attorney, or even your state ethics advisory folks to ask them whether it's appropriate for you to make that decision in that situation.
I was going to say that, Matt, there's the things that we talked about early on that are sort of obvious, again, not being on the front page of the newspaper, but there seems to be an awful lot of this topic. And it seems to me that the best thing to do is really to reach out if you have any question whatsoever, whether it's a friend, whether it's a relative, whether it's, you're just involved in the community, that sort of thing. Seems like there's an awful lot to know, aside of just some of the obvious things. So I think that's good. Well, we have less than 5 minutes left. I'd like to go to each of our distinguished speakers today and kind of a wrap up and what you think, and maybe a little advice for our attendees today on the call. So David, we'll start with you.
Just understand when a situation can come up, when there's some, what we say, an overlap between one's public responsibilities and private interests. And a private interest that can be affected are the people and the entities that you affiliate with, you, your family members, your friends. It could be what church you affiliate with. It could be outside business interests. When a situation comes up, make sure you understand whether there are rules. Now, in Massachusetts, there are 29 different sections to our conflict of interest law. Some of them are fairly intuitive. Bribes. We all know you can't solicit or receive bribes. Nepotism. You can't hire a family member to a job in your agency. That's the intuitive stuff. But, whether you can whether you can accept a gift, it gets fairly nuanced. Whether you can represent some third-party interest before your level of government. The answer to that exciting question, maybe yes, maybe no, depends. So the important thing that we constantly underscore is you've got enough to do just managing your day-to-day. You have enough to learn, to know, to communicate. You don't have the time to become an expert on this conflict of interest law, but in the public interest, it demands that you understand it. So we are here. Know where your resources are. It's important to know what the standards are, but absent that, know where to get the answers to your questions. And you'll go a long way to enjoying a long and prosperous career in public service. And then make sure from top down, you're setting the standard for your employees.
Matt, last comment, last minute?
That's it. I think just
Final thoughts.
Preparedness, foreseeability, understanding that the decisions you make as a leader are made in a fishbowl, and that you have to be prepared to defend your decisions, and you don't want to have your decision be the one again that's above the hole, above the fold in the Springfield Republican, the Boston Herald, indicating that you made a decision that was questionable. We all know you find a way to justify it, but if you have a question, reach out to the ethics officials either in your community or in your state and get some sort of definitive answer if they can provide you one.
Dave Giannotti, Matt Reed, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a tremendous amount of great information, and we want to really thank you for joining us on behalf of the New England chapter of APWA. Folks, you see the Regina just had on the screen the evaluation. Hopefully you use the code there to submit an evaluation of today's session.
I also put a link in the chat box, URL.
Excellent. So again, we hope that again, David and Matt, this was great, and really for taking the time to join us today. We'll look forward to seeing everybody in March for our first session of 2025. Again, want to thank the sponsors again of the New England chapter for helping out with bringing these programs forward. And we hope that everybody has a great Thanksgiving. And thank you again for joining today.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the holidays.
Thank you.